Welcome to
Coming to America, the Era of Mass Immigration.
an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you.
Have you ever visited the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor? Easily one of the most famous and iconic landmarks in the world. The statue symbolizes the freedom and liberty the United States has represented to people throughout its history. The Statue of Liberty was also the first sight that millions of immigrants, millions of new Americans once saw as they arrived in the country that would be their new home. At the base of the statue, on a plaque, is inscribed a famous poem by Emma Lazarus, The New Colossus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. By the end of this tutorial, you should understand where immigrants came from during the era of mass immigration and why so many left their native lands for America's shores. You'll know the difference between the old and new immigration of this period, and you'll learn where immigrants lived, how they lived, and how they were treated by others. You'll learn all about Ellis Island, the most famous port of entry for immigrants to enter the United States. And you'll learn about how Asian immigrants were treated on America's west coast, and how their experience differed from that of European immigrants in the East. The immigration of foreigners to the United States has always been one of the most powerful forces shaping this nation's history. Truly, ours is a nation of immigrants. With the exception of Native Americans, pretty much everyone who calls themselves an American today is an immigrant, or is descended from those who once immigrated to this country, reaching back to the Pilgrims. Until the early 20th century, the U.S. had few rules or restrictions on who could cross the nation's borders and become a new American. Terms like illegal immigrant had no meaning. If you were in the United States and planned to stay, then you were an American. We might call this an open-door policy. This attitude changed following a wave of mass immigration between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I, from about 1865 to 1914. During this 50-year period, the population of the U.S. almost tripled, from about 35 million in 1865 to about 100 million by 1914.
Not all that growth was due to immigration, but much of it was, as immigrants, their children, and their children's children helped transform and create modern America.
It's estimated that at least 25 million immigrants entered the U.S. legally during this time. The total number may be 30 million or even higher. New Americans entered the nation from every direction. Europeans flooded in from the east, mostly through Ellis Island. Japanese, Chinese, and other Asian immigrants entered the U.S. through ports on the west coast. French Canadians moved south, settling in New England. And Mexicans and other Latin Americans moved north, often settling in California and other states of the Southwest. We'll focus mainly on European immigration in this tutorial, as these immigrants represent the vast majority of those who entered the United States during this period. The mass immigration of Europeans to the U.S. came in two distinct waves. Often, they are called old and new immigration. The old immigrants, those who entered the U.S. before 1890, came mostly from Northern and Western Europe, countries like Germany, England, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. But after 1890, the pattern shifted. Most of the new immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, countries like Italy, Russia, Poland, Turkey, Romania, and Greece. The numbers of new immigrants dwarfed those who had come before. In the years before World War I, an average of 1 million Europeans came to America each year, most of them arriving in New York City. An immigrant is one who travels to a new country, like the U.S., with the intention of settling there. An emigrant is one who leaves their old country for a new one, probably for better opportunities there. So why did immigrants emigrate to the U.S. in such large numbers, leaving behind, in most cases, almost everything they had ever known? Almost all immigrants did so because they were seeking better lives for themselves and their families. In many cases, they were leaving behind poverty or dangerous circumstances in their native lands. In the late 19th century Europe, populations were increasing, and unlike the sprawling United States, smaller European nations couldn't always accommodate the extra people. In some places, there wasn't enough food to go around, and people lived in desperate poverty. In Italy, a major economic depression caused many Italians to abandon their country for good. And in Russia and Eastern Europe, Jews were persecuted and attacked for their religion in a series of assaults known as pogroms. Jewish families fled to America in large numbers in order to survive. In the U.S., the Second Industrial Revolution was in full swing. This meant a strong demand for the kind of unskilled labor needed to run America's factories. Immigrants knew that they would be able to find jobs in America even if they were difficult and low-paying, and they knew that once they were established in the United States, their children and their grandchildren would have better and better opportunities with each new generation. As America's big cities became more dominated by immigrants, people in Europe increasingly realized they could move to the U.S. and still live among others with the same language, culture, and religion. Immigrants already in the U.S. communicated with overseas friends and family by letter, encouraging them to join them in America. They could even buy prepaid tickets for their loved ones to make the voyage. Most immigrants, unless they entered the U.S. directly from a neighboring country, traveled by steamship, like the one you see here. The Immigration Act of 1882, passed by Congress, was the first comprehensive law concerning immigration into the United States. It had two main components. One was a head tax of 50 cents on each immigrant entering the nation, to be paid to the U.S. Treasury into a fund used to pay for regulating immigration. This fee would rise in time to be as high as $8 by 1917. The other components of the law gave immigration officials the power to deny certain immigrants entry to the U.S. and expel them. The act banned any convict, lunatic, idiot, or any person unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge, or charity case. To enforce this law, immigration officials were stationed at official ports of entry, the largest of which was New York City. New York's first immigration office was Castle Garden, a former fort at the tip of Lower Manhattan. But by the 1890s, the federal government needed a much larger and more isolated facility to process the many millions of new arrivals yet to come. A massive three-story structure was built on Ellis Island in New York Harbor, close to the island on which the Statue of Liberty sat. The facility, managed by the new Federal Bureau of Immigration, opened in 1892. It was able to process 5,000 immigrants a day. Between 1892 and 1954, when the facility was closed, 12 million new Americans would pass through Ellis Island and would remember it as their introduction to the United States. Steamships filled with immigrant passengers would dock in New York Harbor, and immigrants were then ferried over to Ellis Island to begin their new lives. Only steerage passengers experienced Ellis Island. Immigrants who could afford more expensive tickets were usually able to disembark directly into New York City and their new lives. At Ellis Island, immigrants first went through quarantine, where they answered questions about their medical history and where doctors checked them for symptoms of disease. Then they went through customs, declaring what possessions they were bringing into the United States. Lastly, they went through registration, answering the government's questions about their name, nationality, occupation, destination, age, marital status, education, and how much money they carried. The entire process took between 2 and 5 hours. Ellis Island is sometimes characterized as a gloomy place where immigrants were ill-treated and harassed. That wasn't usually the case, however. Immigration officers were busy and overworked, but most did their jobs efficiently and treated the new arrivals with respect and as much compassion as they could. The main hall of the facility, which you can see here, was a grand space with brass chandeliers and handcrafted tiles decorating its vaulted ceiling. For many immigrants, it was probably the fanciest and most impressive thing they had ever seen. Few were rejected by immigration officials, probably 2% at the most. and those who looked sick were detained in Ellis Island's hospital facilities and received treatment. If they got better, they could enter the U.S. The old immigrants, those who came to the U.S. prior to 1890, tended to spread themselves relatively evenly throughout the country when they arrived. Many traveled with enough money to buy a train ticket to parts of the U.S. where land was plentiful and affordable. Norwegians settled in Minnesota, Swedes settled Nebraska, Germans settled Missouri, but most new immigrants stayed in the big cities. Jobs of some kind were always available there, and many of the new arrivals were too poor to travel further or to buy land. By 1900, almost two-thirds of the nation's immigrants lived in large urban centers like Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and New York City. In all those cities, foreign-born immigrants and their American-born children outnumbered native-born Americans. In Chicago, they made up 75% of the population. In New York, it was 80%. Immigrants of like origin settled in sections of cities that soon acquired ethnic names: Chinatown, Little Italy, Germantown. Not everyone came to stay. A good percentage of European immigrants, mostly single young men, worked for a year or so and then returned home with the money they made. Some repeated the cycle several times. Immigration officials called them birds of passage. Newly arrived immigrants often had a difficult time adjusting to their new lives. Most would achieve the American dream in time, but it didn't happen overnight. An old Italian saying became a joke among immigrants: "I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold." When I got here, I found out three things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them. By necessity, many immigrants lived in tenement buildings in the poorest parts of cities. Tenements often lacked windows, plumbing, or running water. Several families might share a room or rooms designed for one family only. Jacob Riis, a photographer and journalist, took photos of tenement life, like the one you see here, and published them in a famous book, How the Other Half Lives, in 1890. The strong public reaction to the book led to reform and many improvements in the living conditions of poorer immigrants. Not everything was bad for immigrants. Foreign language newspapers published in all big cities connected people and made them feel part of a larger group. 3,500 foreign language papers appeared between 1884 and 1920. More German papers were printed than that of any other group, and immigrants were often helped in their new urban settings by political bosses. Local leaders whose political machines provided services for immigrants, setting them up with employment and housing. What did they ask in exchange? Their votes on election day, which most immigrants were happy to provide. In this way, urban bosses remained powerful figures that controlled city life, and the loyalty of immigrant voters fueled their political success. Because they attended school, immigrant children were quick to become fluent in English, quicker usually than their parents. In this way, children often led their parents in the process of becoming Americanized. As new Americans with different languages and customs, often arriving at the bottom of the economic ladder, immigrants were subjected to prejudice on many different levels. The newspapers and political cartoons of the era were full of ethnic jokes. This insulting cartoon regarding the Italian population is typical of the era. On top, it shows Italian immigrants sleeping in the streets, living in a tightly packed tenement apartment, and enjoying an afternoon's pleasure diversion, a knife fight. At the bottom, it shows the way to arrest them, and the way to dispose of them, drowning them in the ocean. Even those who had been immigrants themselves only a generation or two before, Irish Americans for example, stereotyped the newcomers as lazy, criminals, or animals. Not too long before, others had said the same about the Irish. One of the leading intellectual ideas at this time was called social Darwinism. It was a racist theory that said that white people were at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and that as a result they deserved economic success and political power. Other people were genetically inferior, and this, said people who believed in social Darwinism, explained why these races came from places that were poorer and less successful compared to the United States. In fact, it was common at this time for Americans to speak of immigrant groups as entirely separate races, the Polish race, the Italian race, the Jewish race. It's probably not surprising that as immigration increased, nativism, the rejection of immigrants and the cultures they represent, increased as well. There were few laws in the late 19th century concerning who could immigrate to the U.S., but many people started to think there should be more. They called for government measures to limit immigration. One group of Americans calling for such measures were old-school Yankee aristocrats, people with wealth and prominent family names. They said that the new immigrants were diluting the character and moral fiber of America. They called for a literacy test, knowing that many poorer immigrants couldn't read and would be rejected. Congress passed such a bill in 1896, but it was vetoed by President Grover Cleveland, who thought such a law would be unworthy of the United States. It is said that the quality of recent immigration is undesirable, said Cleveland. The time is quite within recent memory when the same thing was said of immigrants who, with their descendants, are now numbered among our best citizens. Another group opposed to immigration were the leaders of organized labor unions. It concerned them that the new arrivals would often work the least desirable jobs for the lowest wages. Labor leaders worried that this would undermine what they had been trying to achieve for skilled workers in their unions: higher wages and better working conditions. Asians who immigrated to the U.S., usually arriving on the West Coast, had a somewhat different experience than the Europeans you've been learning about. Chinese immigrants had come to California for better opportunities, starting with the gold rush of 1849. After, many had been workers on the transcontinental railroad that connected the East and West coasts. But Chinese immigrants and their children were excluded from American life in almost every way, and were discriminated against more than any other ethnic group in the country. Chinese Americans were denied naturalized citizenship, which made them a permanent alien class. And they weren't allowed to own land, so most lived in segregated sections of cities like San Francisco, which had a Chinatown with a population of more than 12,000 by 1870. In parts of California, many as 90% of farm laborers were Chinese. Because they worked for such low pay, they made easy scapegoats during economic depressions when they competed for some of the same jobs as poor white Californians. And sometimes, Chinese workers were hired as scab laborers to try and break the strikes of white workers. In 1882, as nativism increased, Congress passed a Chinese Exclusion Act. It ended further legal immigration from China with few exceptions. This was the first federal law ever passed to prevent a specific ethnic group from entering the United States. The act was supposed to last only 10 years, but it was renewed in 1892 and extended permanently in 1902. The Chinese population, which had been as high as 100,000 in 1890, declined to about 60,000 by 1920. The restrictions on Chinese immigration lasted until 1943. Japanese Americans experienced slightly better treatment than the Chinese. They could not become naturalized citizens, but their children could if they were born in the United States. This meant that Japanese family could buy land and settle if they bought it in their children's name. But in the 20th century, as Japan became a world power on the rise, Americans' distrust of the Japanese and new immigrants from Japan increased. Some even called this nativist fear the Yellow Peril, as seen in this insulting cartoon from 1899. In 1906, in response to the backlash, San Francisco's school board ordered that Japanese students, as well as other Asian American children, had to attend a separate, segregated public school. Japanese American parents were highly insulted, and when Japan's government in Tokyo heard of California's policy, it sparked an international incident. Japan became so angry at the U.S. that President Theodore Roosevelt himself intervened and managed to talk the school board into changing its policy. In exchange, Roosevelt and the Japanese negotiated the so-called Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. This deal unofficially ended further Japanese immigration after Japan agreed to sharply reduce the number of passports it issued to prospective immigrants. Because the U.S. government didn't officially ban immigration as it had done with the Chinese, Japan was able to save face. In exchange, California's school boards agreed not to practice segregation against the Japanese already in the country. The age of mass immigration you've learned about transformed America. The United States' largely open-door policy for immigrants for a period of about 50 years truly made this nation a melting pot then and for the future. During this period, America looked to the future, not the past. Where people were going was more important than where they were coming from, but the mass flood of immigrants didn't, and probably couldn't last forever. Immigration continued at full steam until 1914, when World War I began in Europe. Submarine warfare made seas unsafe for travel, and immigration to the U.S. dropped off steeply during the war years. During this time, when the U.S. was at war with Germans and other foreigners, public opinion turned decidedly against immigration. Congress passed an Immigration Act of 1917 that required immigrants to be able to read and write in their own language. It also expanded the groups to be denied entry to include alcoholics, polygamists, and anarchists. And an Asiatic barred zone prevented people from much of Asia and the Pacific Islands from immigrating at all. When mass immigration resumed in the 1920s after the war, there was much resistance. The Immigration Act of 1921 represented a major turning point. For the first time, numerical limits were placed on the total number of people who could immigrate, and a brand new quota system restricted the number of immigrants that could enter the U.S. from certain nations in a given year. For example, there would be a limit on the number of Italians or Russians or Greeks who could immigrate each year. This new law, along with an even stricter Immigration Act of 1924, led to a dramatic drop in overall immigration, and it especially reduced the numbers allowed in from Southern and Eastern Europe, the new immigrants from before the war. The U.S. Border Patrol was founded in 1924 in this anti-immigrant atmosphere.